everyone. Today is going to be a regular movie review, and I decided to watch, and I just got done with watching, Fiddler on the Roof. Yes. Based on the famous musical, this 1971 film adaptation was made. I think it was nominated for several Academy Awards. Also John Williams was responsible for helping out with some of the music, so that's also worth taking into account. But for the most part, I consider it just to be a regular film because I think the film takes a lot of what the play was based off of and tries to incorporate it into the film medium, but I still think that the play is the real ultimate source of the material. So that's why I don't really consider this to be really a classic, but I consider it to be sort of an adaptation to a classic play because this is a really famous play. But mainly what you have to understand going into this movie, if you're interested, is that this is a musical. There's a lot of singing, there's dancing too, and there's a lot of things that involve Jewish culture and Jewish tradition. So if you like those kinds of cultural family type-esque films, this will probably appeal to you. It has all of these different customs, and these customs are very traditional. However, these customs and traditions, as you'll see throughout the film, sort of come into question when the earlier generation starts to be sort of somewhat against the idea of certain traditional values. For example, you will see, and throughout the majority of this film, it basically follows the plot of this Jewish family, and the father, whose name is Tevye, who's played by Chaim Topol, basically is responsible for sort of keeping this kind of tradition within his family because he feels that is the best thing for the family, and it's a part of his faith and his understanding of the world. So he kind of takes it upon himself to decide what's best for everybody else. And you kind of see how his daughters, and he has 5 daughters, but it mainly focuses on 3 of them, the oldest, second oldest, third oldest, and how they sort of break that tradition, and that basically that breaking of tradition is marriage. In the old Jewish tradition, according to this film and according to the musical, women were supposed to give, or couldn't really decide who they would marry. You had to, it had to be something that would be sort of consented to by the dad. The father is basically the leader of the household, and he kind of makes those decisions as to who you can marry. And you have to have sort of his approval, I guess, in order to be sort of accepted into the family and sort of accepted into sort of the Jewish faith, so to speak. And therefore be accepted into the family, because the family is based upon their faith, bases their lives upon their faith, in particular their Jewish faith. And you'll see this throughout the film. They take their faith really seriously, to the point where it actually ends up not really bringing them all close together, but really tearing them apart. You kind of see how each daughter, mainly focusing on the 3, how the oldest one, it's a sort of a breaking of tradition, but it's maybe not as split as the second daughter, and then you'll see how the third daughter sort of becomes the most removed out of the other 2, because for example, the oldest daughter, who is played by Rosalind Harris, and her name is Zettel. She basically wants to marry a poor Jewish man. And this poor Jewish man is played by, I want to find the name, Motel Camsoil, played by Leonard Fry. And at first her father doesn't accept this because he wants her to marry someone who's well off and who has some money. And he actually wants her to marry a butcher that's wealthy, named Lazar Wolf, played by Paul Mann. And basically, he wants her to do that instead. However, later on, as you'll see what ends up happening and how he ends up finally coming to the realization, okay, I should accept their marriage, you sort of realize that there's sort of some hesitance to accepting her and her choice to marry who she wants to marry. And it really tries to emphasize the culture through the music. And I mean, the music was what makes this movie really stand out to a lot of people. A lot of people do remember the music, like the real famous one, The Beginning Tradition, which is really encompassed throughout the film. And you'll see how they're still accepted for the most part, but it's sort of that beginning stage that was kind of iffy. But then they're sort of accepted, and they seem to be the most accepted couple that the family sort of stands behind. But then you'll see that there comes also another daughter, the second daughter, who is played by Michelle Marsh, and she plays Hodie. And basically what ends up happening with her is that she falls for a Jewish man played by Paul Michael Glaser, and his name is Perchek. And basically this sort of becomes a little bit more of a hesitant one than the last one, because at one point he says he's going away. The daughter's lover, Perchek, he says he's going away, but he still wants to marry the Hodel, but the father has a difficulty in accepting that because of the fact that he's leaving, and basically he ends up becoming sort of this rebel force against the Russian, I think towards maybe probably the Russian government, and the Russian government during this time, this is like the early 1900s, was probably run by a Tsar, or somebody of really high power, and the Jewish people in particular were probably considered not the most were considered more of the minority, probably, and not really treated with as much respect, probably. And you'll see how this sort of plays into the film. If you watch it, you'll understand what I'm talking about, and how that they are sort of I don't want to say that they're hostile to them, but they don't treat them with the same amount of kind of dignity and respect, especially towards the way end. And you'll see what ends up happening to the characters as it moves on. But the reason why that relationship becomes more removed from the family is because, again, he's poor, and also because he's a rebel, and rebels are constantly moving and traveling, and she ultimately decides that she wants to be with him, and then you'll see how she becomes more and more separate from the family, because that would mean that she would have to leave them for forever. But they still kind of gave them their consent to marry. Like, the dad was still kind of okay with it. And then there comes the third daughter, who is played by, third oldest, played by Neva Small, and her name is, in the film, is Chava. And basically she falls for, and you'll notice this too in the film as it opens up. If you don't notice, there is a Christian part or area, and there's also a Christian Orthodox area and a Jewish Orthodox area. And they relatively get along, but they don't really interact or socialize. And if you didn't marry somebody within the faith, like within the Jewish faith or within the Christian faith, if you didn't marry within the same faith, you weren't considered legitimate, and you wouldn't really be accepted into the family. And she ends up falling for a Christian Orthodox guy named Fietka, and he's played by Raymond Lovelock. And basically, she since she really does love him, her father can't even accept the marriage, because it's not within their faith. Their love for each other is not legit, because they don't share the same faith. They're not born of the same faith. He's not Jewish and she's not Christian, so that's where you get the most removed, because he won't even consider it legit, and he won't even talk to her. Whereas with the other girls, he was kind of a little bit more open to expressing something. But not marrying within the faith was just something that really crossed the line. And you'll see how this is really sad and kind of unfortunate. But I think what the most important thing to really get out of this movie when you watch it, besides what I've already told you, is that a lot of this film and this musical are just trying to address the idea of tradition, and how tradition ultimately changes over time. How the way we perceive things change, and how we deal with things changes, and then ultimately forces us to move on, and not stay within that regular tradition, but evolve through time. And you will see how this evolvement can force people apart from each other, because they're not on the same terms with one another. And you'll kind of see how each girl, it becomes more and more each generation of the girls, meaning from the oldest to the third, for the most part signifies the idea of how each one breaks tradition even more than the last one, and how ultimately the core foundation of the tradition is sort of lost, because of this growing idea within the younger generation to marry for love and not for financial or political reasons. And you'll see how this ultimately changes. And you kind of do see some development on the father's part, I think, as well as maybe a little bit on the mother's, and the wife of these daughters is played by Norma Crane, and her character's name's Goldie, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but for the most part, she and him sort of question their relationship at one point. There's even a song kind of encompassing that, like, do they really love each other? And the thing is they never really asked those questions, because they were just married off, and they didn't even know each other until their wedding day. So these whole new ideas and all these kinds of concepts of what love is. It's different than what they think within their tradition. And it's hard because you want them to sort of maybe be open and accepting the other characters, the other daughters, but sometimes that's not always the case, because some people just don't have the ability to see past their myopic viewpoint and see past their tradition, and in accepting people who are different. And I think tradition really, what it does is it tries to keep things the same. At one point you'll see them arguing over whether or not men should be allowed to dance with women. They would have like a separation, and then somebody came up and sort of tested that tradition, and then they decided to sort of break it and be with people that are different, because women and men are different, but they were still able to sort of get along and be happy. But I think what it ultimately comes down to, and I think what the main character, meaning the father, because the father practically takes up the majority of this film, Tevye, I think his problem is he's, and it's a basic, I think, human instinct, is that we fear change. We fear change because we don't know what change will entail for people, and we have comfort in knowing that things are the same, and knowing that things aren't going to change, and that we can live in this life that doesn't evolve or is different. It just is the same. And I think that's the problem some people have, and I think maybe even some parents may today have. They can't accept beyond their own tradition, and this is what ends up causing all of this division ultimately, because they're not willing to see beyond their tradition. They're only willing to see what their tradition has and what their culture is used to, but not beyond any of that. So for the most part, that's really what you have to understand in this film. For the majority of what it's talking about, it's trying to address the idea of tradition and how tradition ultimately tears people apart, and not being open and to accepting other things can sort of ruin relationships. And I think it also brings up a good point too, in how the Jews were looked down upon because they were different within this time period, and how they were forced to obey certain things and follow certain orders that they were given. And it shows that the reason being is that was tradition, that was custom, because those were the rules under the government of the time. So you will see how that plays in, and how even within that there is still like this Jewish tradition as well, that is not open to accepting and embracing certain things and things that are different, and sort of forcing people away from their lives. And you will really see this great similarity between this particular family's relationships and the broader spectrum of the government, who is basically in charge of everybody in Russia. So I think that's really all I can say about this film. Any questions, comments, concerns, I'm more than happy to answer them. And until next time.